Zimbabwe. On April 18, 1980, Zimbabwe became independent. The country had fertile farmland, working mines, and strong schools. In the 1980s and 1990s, it ranked among Southern Africa's richer economies, the top exporter of flue-cured tobacco, strong gold and platinum sales, and electricity from Kariba Dam. Between 1996 and 1998, tobacco exports averaged 127,000 tons, bringing steady foreign currency. People called it the breadbasket of Africa. The collapse began on November 14, 1997, when President Robert Mugabe announced $4.2 billion Zimbabwean dollars in payouts to war veterans. In one day, the Zimbabwe dollar lost 71.5% of its value, a moment remembered as Black Friday. The next year, Mugabe sent troops to the Congo War, burning $1 million a day. By February 2000, his government launched fast-track land seizures. Commercial farms were destroyed, food production crashed, exports disappeared, and banks froze credit. The central bank printed money non-stop, lopping zeros from the currency in 2006, 2008, and 2009. By November 2008, inflation hit 79.6 billion%. On January 16, 2009, a $100 trillion note appeared, worth less than a loaf of bread. Argentina. In the 20th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries in Latin America. Its fertile pampas produced endless beef and grain, and Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America. By the 1970s, people still lived well, but the state was drowning in debt. On March 24, 1976, a military junta seized power and borrowed heavily abroad. When democracy returned in 1983, Argentina already owed billions. To cover deficits, the central bank printed money. By 1989, inflation soared to 3,000% annually. On July 6, 1989, President Raúl Alfonsán resigned early, passing power to Carlos Menem as prices doubled every few weeks. The Argentine austral currency collapsed. Families rushed to markets before wages lost value overnight. In 1991, Menem's finance minister, Domingo Cavallo, pegged the new peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar, briefly calming markets. But debt piled again. By 2001, Argentina defaulted on $93 billion, the largest sovereign default in history. Riots erupted, banks froze accounts, and 5 presidents fell in 2 weeks. Decades later, Argentina still battles debt and inflation, haunted by the fear of another collapse. Weimar Germany. At the start of the 20th century, Germany was Europe's industrial powerhouse. It built railways, chemical plants, and factories, and ordinary families felt secure. But after World War I, defeat and reparations broke that strength. On June 28, 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, forced to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations. With little gold, Berlin printed paper marks to cover the debt. At first, inflation crept slowly. By January 1922, $1 US equaled 191 marks. By November 1923, it took 4.2 trillion marks. Chancellors Joseph Wirth and later Wilhelm Kuno worsened the spiral by printing more to pay striking workers during France's occupation of the Ruhr. Prices doubled every few days. A loaf of bread that cost half a mark in 1918 reached 200 billion marks in 1923. Workers were paid twice a day, rushing to markets before chalkboards changed. Children built toys from worthless notes, while pensioners starved on evaporated savings. On November 15, 1923, Chancellor Gustav Stresemann replaced the mark with the Rentenmark. The economy stabilized, but the memory of burning money for heat scarred a generation. Greece. After joining the euro in 2001, Greece felt modern and prosperous. Athenians bought new cars, holidays were booked abroad, and the 2004 Olympics showed the world a confident nation. Much of it, though, was funded by debt. On October 20, 2009, Prime Minister George Papandreou revealed the truth. Greece's budget deficit wasn't 6% of GDP, but 12.7%, later revised to 15.4%. Investors panicked. Greek bonds were dumped. Borrowing costs surged. By May 2010, Greece accepted a 110 billion euros bailout from the EU and IMF, followed by 2 more rescue packages worth over 240 billion euros. Ordinary life broke down. Pensions were cut, unemployment hit 27%, and in Athens, protesters hurled Molotovs at parliament while politicians signed loan agreements they knew could never be repaid. Banks limited withdrawals, salaries vanished into taxes, and strikes shut the country for days. Greece stayed in the euro, but the scars lingered. A generation grew up watching their parents' wages shrink and their future sold to Brussels. Portugal. In the early 2000s, Portugal rode the euro wave. Shiny highways, new apartments, and rising public salaries gave the feeling of progress. But much of it was borrowed. Growth slowed, debt piled, and the 2008 financial crisis exposed the weakness. By 2010, Lisbon's deficit hit 11.2% of GDP, one of the highest in Europe. On April 6, 2011, Prime Minister José Sócrates resigned after Parliament rejected his austerity plan. 2 weeks later, Portugal requested a 78 billion euros bailout from the EU and IMF. Life tightened. Wages and pensions were frozen, taxes climbed, unemployment rose above 17%, and thousands of young workers fled abroad in search of jobs. Teachers, doctors, engineers left Lisbon and Porto for London and Berlin. At home, families cut meals, shop fronts emptied, and whole towns felt abandoned. By 2014, Portugal exited its bailout, praised in Brussels as a success story. Yet for ordinary people, the recovery meant little, because their children were still gone and the country felt hollow. Habsburg Spain. In the 16th century, Spain was the richest empire on earth. Silver poured in from the mines of Potosi in Mexico. Seville's docks glittered with bullion. King Philip II built palaces, waged wars, and declared Spain defender of Catholic Europe. But the wealth was borrowed. On September 1st, 1557, Philip declared bankruptcy, defaulting on debts to German and Italian bankers. He would do the same in 1575, 1596, and twice more after. Wars in the Netherlands, the Armada against England in 1588, and endless campaigns drained treasure. Inflation followed. By 1600, prices in Castile had quadrupled compared to a century earlier. Ordinary Spaniards saw no empire, only taxes. Farmers lost land, artisans faced soaring bread prices, and noblemen hoarded titles while the crown pawned future silver shipments. By the 17th century, Spain's wealthiest days were behind it, leaving the empire drowning in debt. Its coins clipped and its power fading. Venezuela. In the 1970s, Venezuela was called Saudi Venezuela. Oil exports made it South America's richest nation. Caracas glittered with highways and malls, and middle-class families vacationed in Miami. President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized oil in 1976, promising endless prosperity, but corruption spread. By the 1980s, debt mounted and oil prices fell. Inflation began to climb. In 1999, Hugo Chavez came to power using oil money for vast social programs while dismantling private enterprise. For a while, it worked, until crude collapsed in 2014. By 2018, inflation hit 65,000%, and by 2019, the IMF estimated it at 10 million%. Salaries bought nothing. Doctors fled hospitals, shops sat empty. The bolivar was redenominated 3 times, each time lopping zeros, each time failing. Families scoured trash for food. Children fainted in schools. More than 7 million Venezuelans fled abroad, making it one of the largest migrations in modern history. The land of oil wealth was left with worthless paper and broken promises. Soviet Union. By the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union was a superpower. It launched Sputnik in 1957, sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit in 1961, and built vast armies and industries. On May Day parades, tanks rolled past the Kremlin while workers were told they lived in the future. But behind the parades, shortages grew. Farms underperformed, factories built poor goods, and billions were spent on the arms race. Oil revenues masked the weakness until prices fell in the 1980s. By 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev took power, the system was bleeding. His reforms, perestroika and glasnost, opened debate but also unleashed crisis. By 1989, queues stretched for blocks, shelves were empty, and republics demanded independence. In 1991, after a failed coup, the USSR dissolved. The ruble collapsed, and people's savings evaporated. Families sold heirlooms for food, soldiers deserted unpaid, and statues of Lenin toppled across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union had once promised abundance. At its end, it could not even provide bread.